not registered or declined. We've got our chairs for the QM. So I think we're ready to go.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening for some of you, and welcome to the CAG September 2020 virtual meeting. It's great to see everyone here today, and we have quite a bit we need to cover, and I think we have a lot of really good material. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for some of you, and welcome to the CAG September 2020 virtual meeting. It's great to see everyone here today. Okay, I've got some feedback there, so hopefully that will be resolved. But I wanted to not only welcome all the members of the CAG, but some of our guests, which include Tom Seidenstein, who is the IAASB chair, Fiona Campbell, who is the deputy IAASB chair, Galen Hansen, who is the IASB CAG chair, and James Gunn, who is the managing director of professional standards. We also have our PIOB observer, Mr. Shijo Kashawagi, and he will be observing this CAG meeting. We have our official observers we welcome, Ms. Megan Zietzman, who is the chief auditor of the PCAOB, and George Kamui, who is from the International Monetary Fund, and he is attending as an observer with speaking rights. He will be replacing Simon Bradbury. Mr. Kamui is the division chief for safeguards assessments in the finance department of the IMF. And we have our observer, Dawn Maglici, who is of the SMPC community, and we welcome Dawn. She's a familiar face. We do have a couple of new CAG representatives, Mr. Paul Munter, who is replacing Nigel James. As you know, Nigel James served for a very long time on the CAG, and Paul comes in. He is a deputy chief accountant of international activities in the Office of the Chief Accountant of the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission. He leads the activities on international matters, which include IOSCO, IAASB, IAASB, among others. And I'd like to welcome our public observers. We're going to be live streaming through YouTube, and so hopefully we'll get a lot of individuals that are watching. We do have a couple of apologies. Henry Fortin of the World Bank was unable to attend, as was Inak Zakar and Tara Wolf. And finally, I wanted to give a few farewells. One is to Nigel James, who I just mentioned, and Nigel James served for his term of 9 years. That's quite a long time on the CAG, and we really appreciate all his contributions to the CAG, and he'll be missed. Also leaving is Simon Bradbury, who is with the IMF, as I mentioned, and he has also been a long-time contributor of the CAG, and we will miss him as well. And finally, unfortunately, a former CAG chair has passed away, and that some of you may have known him. That is David DeMont, and I'm going to pass this on to Tom to see if he has any comments.
Well, I did know David. I worked with him for probably stretch it back 2 decades through my IAASB IFRS days. He was a member of the advisory council. David was a tremendous and certainly a unique individual. What you could say about David as it relates to standard setting, he may have been the foremost advocate for user involvement in the standard setting process. And, you know, that's sort of been the holy grail for standard setters, to engage the investment community. And he had a huge role, very generous, kind-hearted, always willing to help. So David will be missed greatly. So I think that, but I also, it reminds me of the service that he, but also that all of you bring to this as volunteers. And so your work is much appreciated. I would say is a sort of a bittersweet moment today, is because in fact, the last thing before the world sort of shut down that we did was convene as a CAG, for the most part, in person. So it's great to see that you're all on the call, that all is well. I could just tell you, we have not taken it easy since we met last. Our work has proceeded with due speed, even though we'll talk about some of the adaptations to our work plan tomorrow. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your service, and our condolences to David's family and friends. So back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. And we do have quite a few important topics that we're going to discuss. Those include the quality management projects, group audits, and audit evidence. We're going to cover all those today. And then tomorrow, we're going to cover less complex entities, fraud and going concern, and the IAASB work plan. And so there's a lot of great topics for CAG feedback, and I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. It is hard to believe, Tom, that we were probably just about the last meeting, certainly the last meeting I was involved in, where we met live and in person. So a lot has changed since then. With respect to some of the highlights for the days, I know many CAG members have been exposed to the QM standards, and we brought it back to the CAG in part because there was a delay in the approval of the QM projects to September 2020. And so this gives you one last look at those proposed standards, and they are targeted for approval by the IAASB meeting next week. For the group audits, we had an update on the project in the March meeting, and the comment period was extended from 120 days to 150 days, obviously because of the COVID. And so we look forward to that update. In terms of audit evidence, there was a consideration of the draft audit proposal, ISA 500, and that's going to be considered by the board for approval in December 2020. In terms of day two, I think we're going to have lots of good conversation about LCE and scalability and understandability, and where how the LCE task force is progressed. We're also going to talk about the activities related to fraud and going concern. And in particular, I'd like to get some feedback from the CAG in terms of some of the expectations that the IAASB board should consider as it relates to fraud and going concern. And then finally, of course, COVID has affected the IAASB's work plan. And we'll talk a little bit about what their plan looks like for 2021 and provide some feedback on that. And then finally, we will end with the private session, as we always do, and we will go from there. Willie, I don't know if you have any comments on the private session now that I've mentioned that, but I'll turn it to you to see if you have any.
Thank you, Jim. Maybe just a reminder for everyone that this private session will obviously be used to also address the election of the CAG chair. You will all remember that towards the end of June, we did circulate a communication to all CAG representatives and CAG member bodies about the election of the CAG chair that was coming up for this meeting. We were also at that point very conscious of the fact that, we're going into a period where the monitoring group proposals have also been issued, and there will be a transition and implementation of those proposals. And in that context, Jim has indicated that he is available for reappointment, also recognizing that because of the period we're going in with the monitoring group proposals having to be implemented, there may be additional asks from the CAG chair, as well as the CAG chair's term may also be affected depending on how these activities proceed. And therefore, you will remember we did have a call for nominations, but we also anticipated that if there are no nominations from the CAG member bodies, that we can probably follow an expedited process to ratify Jim's appointment for an additional term. That process has also been coordinated and cleared with the PIOB. And at the closing date, you were all informed that we did not receive any nominations apart from Jim being available for reappointment. So tomorrow's session will therefore be used to ratify Jim's appointment by a simple majority vote in private session. And for that session, we would then just ask that members amongst themselves elect someone to just lead that part of the private session, after which Jim can come back into the meeting, and then you can proceed with your private session, and then after that go into the executive session as we normally do. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Billy. And I'd also like to reach out to Tom and James to see if either one of you have comments. I'll start with Tom to kick our meeting off.
Well, I think I probably said my comments already, Jim, but I just look forward to a productive meeting. So thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Tom. James?
No, nothing. I just wanted to echo your thanks to the board and to the CAG for their participation and their contributions in advance. Perhaps nothing highlights the importance of this conversation and CAG members, representatives' input other than the agenda itself. And I think the substantive topics that are presented today for input is a worthwhile endeavor to make sure that we're contributing to, I think, public interest pivotal items on today's work program. So thank you in advance.
Thank you, James. And I realize that probably many of you have dealt with Zoom. Personally, it seems like I spend my entire days in Zoom sessions, but I did want to have Phil just talk a little bit about the Zoom protocol. And for some of you, this may be a new experience, and it does take a few seconds to get up and running on that. So Phil, anything on Zoom protocol you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm sure most of you are experts by now on Zoom, but for our newer CAG representatives, we ask that for the duration of the call that you are on mute. There will be quite a few opportunities to ask questions or to raise comments. When you would like to make a comment, just use the raise hand function. If you go down to participants, you'll see there's a raise hand function. And once you've raised your hand, you can just also lower your hand after your question. A reminder after you've raised your question to please also mute yourself again. If not, we will have some feedback, and Karen or I as organizers may just mute on your behalf. So don't worry, there's not a virus on your computer. And that is it. Through every session, Jim will monitor the raised hands, and he will also ask the PIB observer for any comments at the end of any session. I've distributed a detailed guidance of the protocols on Thursday, but if you have any questions throughout the call today or tomorrow, just message Karen, Cheryl, or myself, and we'll gladly assist you. Thank you, Jim.
Great. And I'd like now to recognize our CAG observer, which is Shigo Kashiwagi. And Shigo, I wanted to see if you had any opening comments. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, James. I just look forward to listening to the views of the CAG representatives on these important issues. So I have nothing to add at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it evening where you are, or is it morning?
No, it's 8 o'clock at night.
Okay. Okay. Great. And then our first order of business is the minutes from the CAG public session, the live session, March of 2020. And so I'd like all CAG members to consider agenda item A1. There's a marked up version distributed to the CAG on July the 13th and have approval for the minutes. So if anyone would like to approve the minutes, that would be very helpful. Not hearing anyone that has an issue with the minutes, I'll take that as a implicit approval of the minutes. Okay, so noted, the minutes will be approved. And that will bring us right to our first speaker session. And the first presenters will be in the area of quality management. Now, we have heard quite a bit about quality management. We appreciate the IAASB board's sharing of the quality management, and we've really been through this throughout the process. And I think we're really at the final stretch. So I wanted to welcome the presenters. And Julie Corden, are you on the line?
I'm here. Jim, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I will hand it over to you, and then anyone else you'd like to introduce on your team. So
okay, well,
I look forward to hearing the final elements.
They're not all on the call though, but I may call on Natalie from time to time because she's a bit of the historian in this project. So if a question goes back too far, I might have to call on her history. But good morning. I'll say good morning. It's morning for me, and I was just thinking about, I've been on a little bit of a summer break, so this is my first day back, first meeting. So hopefully my voice holds out and my brain's all up to speed on QM1 because I did take a little break there. So we're going to cover a couple of key things that you would have seen in your package that was circulated to the group. I'm going to walk through the slides. Phil, I think you're the one that's running the slides, so I'll ask you when it's necessary to change them. I also think the order of presentation that I planned for this session was also to walk through basically the slides in order. I will pause where we have a couple of questions for the group, Jim, if that's okay. And then I wasn't planning on covering the detail of the report back, which was also in your package, but just to highlight the fact that in that cover note and report back, we had some summary there of our March discussion on ISQM1 and some of the feedback we got from the CAG then and how we've dealt with that feedback. So again, not planning to cover that in detail, but that was in your package as part of the pre-read. So with that, I'll go to the next slide, Phil.
It's actually Karen Sherrill. Yeah, but thanks.
Oh, sorry, Karen. Karen then. So what has happened? Quite a bit's happened. As Jim mentioned in his introductory comments, we would normally have been talking to you, I guess, in September about the fact that the standard had been approved by the board in June, but given the COVID pandemic and all that was going on, that approval was pushed until September. That definitely did not mean that we took our foot off the gas as it relates to ISQM1. And in fact, we used that June meeting to get through some very substantial items in ISQM1. And so it was very helpful for us to have that June meeting to clear through some of those items with the board. Back in March, you'll recall we did talk about the effective date with this group. The effective date has been discussed and deliberated by the board, and it has been agreed to a date of December 15th, 2022. And then just to summarize the 3 plenary sessions that we have had with the IAASB or the board and I mentioned the June meeting being there, a key one was moving the standard along. We are now, as you know, at the meeting for September, the CAG meeting today for ISQM1 discussion, and then the IAASB meeting is upcoming next week and the week following. And there's quite a bit of time dedicated in that meeting agenda to all of the quality management standards. And so we're working through and marching to an approval date for September with the board. Next slide. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm really going to touch on two key items. We've labeled them key changes. They are really things that have been a fair amount of deliberation over the last little while with the task force, and things we'll be discussing with the board come next week. One being the objective of the standard, so I'll go through that one first. And then I'll move to the external communications, which you would be, if you were at the March meeting, you'd be familiar with that topic. We have also listed clarifications related to human resources there as a key change. If you were looking in your presentation, you'll notice there wasn't a question on that for the group. Really what we are planning to do there is I will go and just summarize at a high level what we've done with respect to human resources in ISQM 1, and also highlight the fact that that was a coordination effort between all of the QM task forces to ensure that we had dealt with the use of human resources and engagements through the suite of standards. So I'll just summarize that, but there is no question on that particular change. And then on this slide, you will also see a number of the other items listed there. We don't have a question for the group. And really those areas, while there's been quite a bit of work done there and discussion at the board level on those items, they were really clarifications of content that already existed in the standard. And so we don't have that in our discussion paper for today. But if you were keen and wanted to look at the marked up version between March and September for the standard, you would see that there have been some movement in those sections with respect to how we've clarified content that was there previously. So with that, move to the next slide. So the objective, for those of you that have been around the standard for a while, you'll have to think back to the exposure draft. But in the exposure draft, we had some respondent feedback on the objective of proposed ISQM 1. And the feedback was, I'll classify it as mixed views as to whether the objective, and keep in mind the objective is twofold in ISQM 1. The objective is one, that that professionals perform engagements in accordance with professional standards being those also including relevant ethical standards. And then part two of the objective is that the engagement reports that are issued by the firm are appropriate in the circumstances. So that is the objective. In the exposure draft, we got some mixed views from respondents as to whether or not we should include a reference to public interest in that objective. We have had some deliberations already, quite a number at the task force and some at the board already, around whether or not that should be undertaken and whether we should have a reference to public interest in the objective. The PIOB has had this item remain on their list of public interest issues, and that the objective should also focus on the firm producing high quality audits as a result of having a system of quality management. And so we did need to have further discussion and deliberation with the task force, and it will be discussed next week at the board further around whether or not we needed to make an adjustment to the objective. Keep in mind that in the exposure draft and subsequent drafts that have been produced and discussed, we did have an emphasis on the public interest. So there were some introductory material added that emphasized the public interest. We did have a clarification in the introductory material that the public interest is served by the consistent performance of quality engagements. And we had explained the link between the public interest and the objective in that introductory material. So that exists in the draft today. So I'll move to the next slide. So we did have a fair amount of deliberation at the task force, keeping in mind that we had this item on the PIOB public interest list of issues. We needed to discuss it further, and then task force did that. That said, the task force still believes that the objective as it's written, which is, as I outlined it for you, the twofold pieces of the objective, is still appropriate, and that the consistent performance of quality engagements is supported by the firm having a system of quality management. The task force also believes that the objective is outcome-based, because part of the feedback we had received from the PIOB was that the objective felt more like a focus on a process as opposed to a focus on an outcome. The task force does believe that the objective remains outcome-based, because the measure for a quality engagement and the way a firm would be measured on their system of quality management is that the engagements are performed in accordance with professional standards and that engagement reports issued are appropriate. So we still believe that that's a measurable objective, and it meets the it meets the objective of having quality engagements produced by the firm. That said, we do recognize the issue. So the content that was in the introductory section of ISQM previously, and we thought was very good content and clarified that link between the objective, the public interest, and quality engagements, we've really just relocated that introductory material closer to the objective so that we can show that linkage between the concepts. And so that has now been moved to paragraph 15, which was in your agenda item B1-2. But if you were looking at previous drafts, that paragraph would have sat up a little bit earlier in the standard in the introductory section. So what we've done is we've relocated it close to the objective because it does have a connection and it nicely draws out the connection between the public interest and the quality engagements. It also has, it's a bit of a support paragraph as well to understanding the objective, and the fact that a firm setting up their system of quality management and evaluating that system, that it has reasonable assurance, is all linked into the same topic. Next slide, please. So that really, Mr. Chair, Jim, that brings us to our first question, where we're looking for representative feedback on the positioning of that paragraph. As I mentioned, we did move it in the standard, and we've drawn that link out between the objective, public interest, and quality engagements in the new draft. So I'll send it over to you, Jim, for feedback from the group.
Thanks, Julie. And to me, the geography of this reference to public interest is not as important as the fact that it's, I think, nicely included in here how you refer to the firm and operating in the public interest with respect to quality management. But I'd be very interested to hear what other members of the CAG, if they have a very strong view in terms of the geography of this reference to public interest. So let me see if I have any hands up.
Jim, we have Takeshi and Paul Munter.
Okay, Paul, welcome. This will be your first comment for the CAG, so we look forward to getting a chance to meet you.
Great. Can we hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you. It's great to be with you. My pleasure to be able to participate. One observation, I don't have any strong feelings about the placement. I think the placement is fine, and I think the emphasis on the public interest is highly appropriate. But one thing that strikes me as perhaps a bit of a subtlety, but when I think about the objectives of quality management, particularly when we think about things like the monitoring process and the like, there should be, I think, an undercurrent there that you're really focusing not only on identifying where there were shortcomings in the past, but a mindset of continuous improvement. That audit quality is, I guess you might describe it as a bit of a journey. And what we might think of today as an appropriate level of audit quality is probably different than what we might have thought of as an appropriate level of audit quality 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, et cetera. I think an important aspect of it is that the firm has embedded in its culture as an objective of some of these processes is that of a continuous improvement environment. And I think that's perhaps a subtlety, but a point that's worth considering, I think.
Paul, thank you. Good point. I'm going to go to our next commenter. Takashi, you have your hand raised.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you for the presentation. I have one comment on the objective. With regard to the objective of this standard ISQM 1, and also my comment is related to the objective in the ISA 220. I understand the perspective of the focusing or emphasizing on the public interest, especially quality engagement in this object. Having said that, but the proposed statement of the objective is, it seems to be a little lengthy and redundant. So the paragraph that is explaining the relationship between the original objective included in the ED and the public interest or relation with the quality engagement that is located in the introduction. And so this current proposal version is replaced from the introduction to into the objective section. This seems to me that the relationship between the original objective in the ED and the replaced statement from the introduction section into the objective, it would not be not clear for me. So I think clear and concise and outcome-based description of the objective is desirable, as you mentioned. So I prefer the this description before that amendment stay in the introduction section. So I think it is easy to understand not only the objective itself, this substandard, but also the linkage between these quality standards and the quality engagement or serving to the public interest. So I prefer the original version before the amendment. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Takashi. Megan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Jim. And hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. So before I go, I just need to give my standard disclaimer that the remarks I make today, and I'll just do it for tomorrow as well, so I don't have to do it again, are my remarks, not those of the PCOB, the board members, or any of its staff. So my views on this, and thank you, Julie, for the background and the explanation. You know, I think I agree with where the task force has landed on this. I recognize that this is a very key and important issue. So I think where the task force's proposal has landed is a good place. I think that it's very important that the objective of the standard is be phrased in something in a way in which it is achievable and capable of being measured. So I think if we look at the way that the objectives are used throughout the ISAs and in the ISQMs, I guess they'll be now, you know, I think it's not the intent for them to be something that's a target that's completely aspirational or that doesn't have a framework that underpins it against which you can measure it, because I think then that will make it difficult for it to be implemented in a consistent way by firms. But I think it also will give rise to challenges on the inspectability and the enforcement aspects. So, you know, I think it does serve the public interest for the objective to be framed in an objective and measurable way. You know, that said, however, I do think that the very key concepts that are intertwined into what's now paragraph 15 are really important in terms of explaining how the public interest is served by the performance of quality engagements. I think it's important to be clear that quality engagements are those that are done in accordance with standards, laws, regs, etc. And then I think it's also really important to intertwine the concepts of skepticism and judgment into that paragraph. So that paragraph, even though it's one paragraph, it kind of does a lot. You know, and I think it, you know, personally, I think it could be in the introduction, but it could be in the objective. I think that having it in the objective, or as kind of a, I guess, essential material that accompanies the objective, you know, then that maybe strengthens the concepts for some. And if that's what makes people comfortable, I think that that's appropriate. And, you know, so I think it's probably in the right place. And then maybe one reflection, and this is just as I was listening to Paul's comments around the, you know, the subtlety of the continuous improvement and proactive management of quality and what have you. You know, it struck me that, I mean, that's maybe part of what the messaging here needs to be, is when you think about the new approach that's being built, it's a proactive risk-based approach to the management of quality. So it's premised on looking at or premised on risk assessment, which is not a once and done, it's an ongoing process, but it's also something that is going to have to take into account the evolving nature and circumstances of firms and their engagements. So, you know, to me, it seems that that's where you kind of are going to capture the need for a firm to continue to be nimble and think about how things change. And, you know, I think there are robust requirements in the standard around risk assessment, but I think that's, you know, to me, that's where you get that continuing, you know, the thing that it's not static, it's not a once and done. It's going to have to continue to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And Julie, I have three more hands raised. Would you like to hear those comments, or would you like to go ahead and comment on what you've heard so far?
We can go ahead, Jim, with the rest.
Great. Dawn?
Thanks, Jim. Just a quick one. The SMP does support moving the public interest issue up in the introductory material because we feel it demonstrates the importance of it. So that's all. Thanks.
Oops, Dawn, I think we lost your last few words. You're in support of moving it up. Is that what I heard?
Yes, that's correct. It supports the importance of it.
Thank you. And finally, Meng. Meng Wei.
Hello. Thanks, James.
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I agree with and support the task force suggestion by including specific reference to public interest in the objective of ISQM 1 and also ISA 220. Last September, some CAG members suggested forming a handbook to guide the drafting of standards. In this handbook, we think it should require that when drafting a standard, we should keep in mind how the public interest is better served and state this clear in the objective of the standard. The inclusion of public interest in ISQM 1 and ISA 220 also is important and a good start, I think. Let's also make sure public interest is also emphasized through other standards setting process. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Meng. Julie, it seems like there's general support for what you've done, and particularly a number of people have mentioned they like the way it's intertwined and relating the public interest to QM, but I'll turn it over to you for any comments.
Okay, yeah, and I was going to get back to the proactive nature of the system of quality management. Megan did an awesome job of summarizing the points there, and it really is, it is all wrapped up in the continuous improvement, the proactive nature, and the risk-based approach, and this is quite new, is really all included in the robust requirements in the standard. So maybe that just, you know, that flavor of it could be drawn out a little bit in any communication material we have, but that, you know, as you read through the standard, you will see that we focus quite a bit on continuous improvement especially in the monitoring remediation section and other areas where this is quite different and new from a risk-based perspective as well. So I was just going to touch on that, but at that point, Jim, but otherwise I will take all the feedback. I think we got general support for what the task force is doing.
Okay. Anyone else? I have one other hand and that has come up. Natasha, good to see you virtually.
Hi, hello. Sorry, I don't have my video on, but my system is not hugely stable. So just thank you very, very much for a really clear presentation. I have just a really quick question, actually, and forgive me if I missed this, but the PIB made some quite good comments, I think, around the objective needing to be outcomes based as opposed to process based, and you had made some alterations in response to that. I just wanted to know actually whether the PIOB had felt comfortable with those changes in going far enough or not. I don't know whether Shigeo could comment on that.
Should I respond now? Or?
Shigeo, you're welcome to respond.
Okay. Well, we appreciate the efforts made by the task force in addressing the issues that we have raised. And we had some discussion within ourselves. And I think we can go along with the task force proposal at this point. And I think we appreciate the efforts made.
Shigeo, thank you for PIB perspective on that. Sounds like you have support. I have Natasha. I'm going to move to Hussein now. Hussein, welcome. Good to, not sure if you're on here or not. Good to see you.
Thank
there
you.
You are. Okay.
You can hear me?
Yes, you're
okay.
Very fine.
I think my comment is about public interest. As all auditing standard, quality management standard, ethics standard, all for public interest. Therefore, I think it's useful to put some statement about public interest in ISQM 1. But I see this statement a little bit big. It needs to be stronger and also align with how these standards serve public interest. What is the reason? Why do we need to put this statement here? Therefore, this paragraph 15 should be enhanced and align more detailed with public interest. It should be better, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Hussein. Julie, I think that's all the hands we have on this particular topic.
Yep. Are you okay then if we've got the feedback, so are you okay if we move on? Jim?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Okay. I will ask for the next slide then, please. Sorry, slipping my notes here. External communication. So for those of you who were at the March CAG meeting, we had a fulsome discussion there about the requirement in the ISQM1 standard with respect to externally communicating about the firm's system of quality management. And just a brief look back to the exposure draft. In the exposure draft, we had a requirement in the standard that the firm would establish policies and procedures addressing communication with external parties. There was a reference to a transparency report or otherwise in that requirement. And then it said when the firm determines it appropriate to do so. Like the feedback we got from the meeting in March from this group, we did get mixed or differing views on that requirement in the exposure draft. And I guess in addition, the respondent feedback also highlighted the fact that there was a lack of clarity on the expectations as to those words that said when the firm determines it appropriate to do so. So some supported the requirement to stay as is, some had suggestions, some thought that the requirement was burdensome, but that aside, we've had quite a number of discussions on external communications with the task force a few times now with the board. I mentioned that the discussion we had back in March with this group, and the PIOB has continued to have this item on their public interest list of issues, which was requests for more explicit requirements for the firms to communicate externally. So it does remain, it did remain an issue on their list up until now. Next slide, please. So what have we done? As I mentioned, we've deliberated a number of times at the board on this topic. We have considered how to address the issue, which was multifold. One was to introduce more robust requirements for audits of listed entities that would focus on communication externally with those charged with governance. We also wanted to ensure that the standard was flexible enough and encouraged firms to communicate externally when it is appropriate to do so, and that should be a firm determination, as was consistent with the ED, and that while the ED had a reference to transparency reports, and we recognized that one way of externally communicating would be through a transparency report, the requirements for those reports and the variety and disparity in the reports across jurisdictions, we felt that that requirement for a specific type of report would be dealt with better by regulatory at a jurisdictional level due to the variety that exists. What we have done, though, in the draft standard, you would have seen in the paper that's going to the meeting next week for the board, and it's been discussed previously with the board. So we hope that as a task force, we have really just faithfully drafted what the board had suggested to us back from the June meeting. Is we have a requirement to communicate with those charged with governance when performing an audit of financial statements of listed entities. And that requirement is for the firm to describe how the system of quality management supports the consistent performance of quality engagement. So you'll see that wording links back to the objective of ISQM 1. And that additionally, the firm has policies and procedures that would require external communication when it is otherwise appropriate to communicate with external parties. So we have the requirement that for audits of listed entities, you have to externally communicate about your system of quality management to the audit committee or those charged with governance. And then secondly, we still have a requirement in the standard for the firm to have policies and procedures that address other communications outside of just those types of engagements. So that might be audits of non-listed entities, that might be your public sector audits, that might be other engagements that are covered by ISQM 1 where it would be appropriate to communicate externally. So we have the sort of the two pieces in the standard as it's drafted right now. Next slide, please. So, why, I guess the question might be, you might have is, why did we land on communication with those charged with governance being important? We do think that because of the audit committee or the governance role that they play and their responsibility for understanding the oversight of the financial reporting process, it was important that those charged with governance understood what a firm was doing with respect to their system of quality management and how their system of quality management may be designed or may be monitored or reviewed to ensure that there was a consistent performance of quality engagements. And we also really had to keep in mind that this standard applies from the very largest of firms to the very smallest of firms, and that it also applies to a wide variety of engagements. And so we wanted to make sure that we had scalability built into this requirement as well. And so that focus on audits of listed entities made sense. It also aligns to some of the other areas in the ISAs where there are incremental requirements with respect to when you're auditing a listed entity. That said, we do have application material that suggests other circumstances where it might be appropriate. So you'll remember that in that requirement, we have that second piece that says the firm needs to design policies and procedures for other communications or where it's otherwise appropriate. And so we've included application material that suggests a number of circumstances where that might be the case. And so entities that might have public interest considerations, public sector, or public accountability characteristics. And so that's been included in the drafting as well. Next slide, please. The other topic that we've deliberated and discussed was, do we need to be specific in the standard about what information is included in that communication? We have kept the requirement principles-based, largely because that's how our standards are written. They are written principally and enabled to scale. We did consider whether specific matters should be included in the requirement, but decided against that because one, we didn't want this to be a checklist or some sort of boilerplate information. We wanted to have a firm have the ability to communicate how their system of quality management is tailored and risk-based to their firm and risk-based to their engagements. So we want to encourage that type of reporting. And also, you know, it was going to be quite difficult to come up with a list that would encompass everything that we felt could be included in the communication around the consistent performance engagement. So we've left it principles-based. We have a fair amount of application material that suggests information that might be provided. And then I've already actually covered the last bullet on this slide, which was other enhancements we made to the application material about other types of reporting that might happen or other circumstances where it would be appropriate. Move to the next slide. So Jim, this brings us to question 2 for the group. And we're looking for views from your respondent or views from the representatives about whether our proposed enhancements to this requirement are appropriate, or if they have any other suggestions or feedback on that.
Thank you, Julie. And as I recall in our March meeting, we did have a very robust conversation on this particular topic. We also talked a fair amount about transparency reporting. And so in essence, where you landed, it seems that, yes, they have to, the QM standards require the discussion with those charged with governance, and then where applicable by jurisdictional requirements, there may be an external reporting requirement, which in effect might be a transparency report in a sense. So I expect we're going to have some thoughts here since it was widely discussed at our previous meeting, but let's see if the general sense of the CAG has changed or not. And I see, Paul, you have your hand up. So Paul Thompson.
Thanks, James. Let me get the ball rolling. Not surprisingly, the European Federation of Accountants and Auditors for SME is primarily concerned around scalability of the standard. And in fact, right from the get-go, in the early stages of the project development, we did express some serious concerns. Those concerns have been abated because we've seen the project develop, and the current proposals are, in our view, much more scalable than they were in the first iteration. In terms of this question 2 and the recent changes being proposed for external communications, we are pleased to see that the new requirement is directed at the audit of listed entities. That, I think, is a very clear indication that there's efforts to ensure the standard and its requirements are scalable. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say that with many smaller owner-managed businesses, oftentimes the managers and those charged with governance happen to be the same. Apologies if you can hear some background noise here. I'm sitting outside and I have a railway line not so far from me.
Okay. We heard you just fine. Thanks, Paul. And so any other perspectives? I see Megan, you have your hand up.
Great, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Julie. So I think, I recognize obviously this is a really challenging issue, and I know that the task force has worked hard to address it. I must admit, personally, I continue to think that this whole area is maybe more something that's appropriate for handling at a national or a jurisdictional level, given that jurisdictions around the world are all in different places with respect to what's expected and what's customary, what's required, all that kind of stuff. But I do recognize that the position that the task force is in and the challenges that they've been dealing with to get to this point. So maybe like Paul, I think it's good to have a requirement that's higher level, more principles based, because that does lend itself more to being applied in different ways by different firms, depending on circumstances. So to definitely prefer that to something that's more detailed and prescriptive. I do sort of continue to be a little bit concerned, however, that this could devolve into a bit of a boilerplate exercise in a jurisdiction where this kind of stuff is not already done. There's maybe a concern that the list in, I think it's A126, becomes, kind of a checkbox for a boilerplate written communication. So which really brings me to the next point, which I think is in a lot of cases when you look at the application guidance, which I think is well done and gives a good sort of a good outline of the kinds of things that might be communicated. I think many of these things lend themselves more to a two-way conversation rather than a written communication, particularly if this is directed at the audit committee, because I think part of doing it in that way is to facilitate that conversation, as opposed to just, here's your PowerPoint deck, or here's your your page where you've written a sentence about each of these things. And I recognize that this requirement is not prescriptive in terms of the form of communication, and there is some application guidance which gives some examples of different ways in which it could be done. But I do wonder whether there's a way in the guidance to make it a bit more clear that, maybe put a little bit more emphasis on the fact that it could be accomplished really more effectively through a conversation and a discussion, which obviously would have to be documented for the purposes of the audit of the firm's documentation. But I think that could be something that could be thought about. So yes, I think there probably are some challenges with scalability, but I think the way that it has been set up lends itself better to being able to deal with all of those. So those were my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, we have quite a few hands here. Greg, welcome.
Good morning. Thanks, Jim. And thanks, Julie, for leading us through this change. I'm still struggling a bit with the objective, and I recognize the change in the wording is there to accommodate scalability, which it achieves, in my opinion. But I'm not clear on the objective of the external reporting, or what had been transparency reporting. And perhaps that objective needs to be confirmed to ensure that the requirement is achieving the objective. Is the objective of this requirement to assist in auditor selection? Is the objective to assist in auditor performance monitoring? Is the objective to assist in retention decisions? Or is it some other objective? And the objective, once confirmed, would help to clarify who this requirement should be directed at, or whether the requirement should be completely based on the policies and procedures of the firm. I just wonder if the link to listed entities, while consistent with other aspects of the standard, I'm not sure that linkage is entirely aligned to the objective of the requirement.
Thank you, Greg. Dawn, I also see your hand up.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to echo quite a bit of what Paul's remarks were earlier. The SMP is of the view that the approach taken is consistent. It's much easier to read now. So from an SMP perspective, that's going to make it more user-friendly.
Okay. Anyone else have a different view? I know, again, we had quite a bit of discussion at the last CAG meeting. I just want to make sure everyone's views are represented on this point. So looking for hands. Julie, I guess I'll give it back to you. Oh, there's a hand. Natasha.
Yeah, hi. I was sort of just pondering about how to formulate a helpful comment, but I think actually Greg did a really good job in kind of sort of crystallizing what I was feeling. Certainly, you know, I think the need, just at a high level, the need for better non-boilerplate, to the earlier comment, disclosure with regards to PIEs to members, you know, shareholders, is there. So not just to the audit committee, but actually to the shareholders who are there to then vote and appoint or confirm appointment of that auditor. So really having better and more granular disclosure and transparency would be extremely helpful. And to just echo Greg's point, you know, going back to what are we trying to achieve here? And I think probably a number of things, but being really clear about that to determine therefore whether the proposed level of transparency is sufficient. I mean, I feel that it's for PIEs, and I'm talking about obviously listed entities here, one could go further.
Great, thank you, Natasha. And so that is at least some different views, both from Greg and Natasha, or at least some things to think about, Julie. And Christian, you've raised your hand. I recognize you.
Sorry, I just wanted to thank you, James. I just want to make a quick statement regarding the objective of the transparency and the reporting. I'm not sure whether we really need an objective. If we consider this to be part of the transparency report itself has several objectives. It's not only about auditor's election or the performance. I think this is just something which is then available to the public, and for that reason, I do think it is worthwhile having this in the standard itself.
Thank you, Christian, for that perspective. Kashuhiro. Kazuhiro, Yoshi?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
If you speak a little louder, I'm not quite hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you better.
Oh, thank you. I have just a question regarding the positioning of paragraph 126. Why does this paragraph distinguish those charged with governance and other external parties? Is it implies that at least this level of information should be provided to those charged with governance? I think that the information in paragraph 126 is important not only to those charged with the governance, but also other external parties. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi?
Yes, thank you, James, and hello, everybody. I just wanted to bounce back on Natasha's points around transparency, because at first glance, I would, support the task force proposal first. When I had a look at the papers, I thought that this was a proportionate way forward. But when you think about transparency and effectiveness of communication with those charged with governance, maybe there is some balance to be struck between either going for full transparency and then maybe more boilerplate, and effectiveness of communication with those charged with governance, where it's less transparent to the shareholders, but maybe more effective communication and very much less boilerplate. So I don't know if the task force has reflected on this differentiation between communications and if it's worth exploring.
Thank you, Naomi. Julie, I think I'm hearing some comments about principles versus details in essence, if I'm picking this up correctly. Yeah. But quite a few comments. I'll turn it back to you to see if you have any perspective on what has been said.
Just a couple things, Jim. So the point around the objective of the communication, I think the objective of the communication is multifaceted in my view. I think Greg listed a number of reasons why you might, and I think those are all valid reasons why an audit committee or those charged with governance would be wanting that information about the system of quality management. So I do think it can be quite varied as to the objective of the communication. We've deliberated quite extensively about the requirement here. We keep in mind that it's scalable. We do have a number of application materials that were added, application material paragraphs that were added to really encourage external communication beyond just what's in the requirement, and the fact that there would be laws and regulations in some jurisdictions that require much more, and that there would be circumstances and a firm needs to have is required to have a policy and procedure that outlines when when it would be otherwise appropriate to communicate. So we felt that that was robust, a robust way of dealing with the issue, while still keeping in mind that we have to keep a scalable standard. So I appreciate the feedback, but and we are taking this to the board next week. So I assume we'll have a pretty robust discussion with them as well on the topic.
Great. And Julie, just as a time check, I have about 8:10.
Yeah.
And you are scheduled through 8:50. Do you?
Oh yeah, we're doing well, Jim. These were the two main questions for the group. I have another topic to cover and an overall question, but I think we're doing okay.
Okay, great. All right, let me look and see if there are any other hands on this. This has been a topic that has been of significant interest to the CAG. So I just want to be sure everyone has had an opportunity to provide their feedback. And I don't see any hands up at the moment. So I guess we can go to question 3, and Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, and the next 2 slides are really just, I'm going to summarize them for the group. Human resources has continued to be an area that we needed to get our arms around because it touches a number of the QM standards. The summary of the issue was that there's a number of human resources that take part in the performance of engagements. They come from within the firm. They can come from within the network, other network firms, other firms that are service delivery centers that are part of a network. They can also be engaged through a service provider. And so what we needed to convey in ISQM 1 was, regardless of where those resources come from, the firm has responsibility for ensuring that they are appropriate, either at the firm level or at the engagement level. And then ultimately the firm is responsible for making those sufficient and appropriate resources available to engagement teams. And so really what we've done in these sections, it looks like we've made a number of changes, but we've really just tried to clarify that regardless of where these human resources come from, the firm has responsibilities, and tried to clarify those responsibilities. And so it was really just to summarize that for the group. at a high level to ensure that you understood what those changes were all about. I think that covers the 2 slides on human resources, but I'll just ask to go to the next slide and make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, okay. Actually, so there wasn't a question, Jim, on that. It was really just to give the group feedback if you were looking at the draft and looking at the cover note as to why we were covering that topic. And then we just have one last overall question on any other matters.
And Julie, just for confirmation, in part, the previous slide that you presented, it talked about component units, which I think of ISO 600. And could you give the CAG a little bit of a background about what the issue was or the importance of considering that aspect, just so in case they don't have that?
Sorry, Jim, which one? The component auditor piece?
Yes, it's, I think in your previous slide, if you go back, it talks about the firm's responsibility, including component auditors.
Right. So ISA 220 has a definition within it that defines engagement team. Engagement team includes anybody performing audit procedures on the engagement, which then also includes component auditors. So there was a tie-in also to ISA 600 with respect to how the firm deals with all of its resources. And so the task force had deliberated a few times about how we deal with component auditors in the standard. But what we did was kept it very, I simplified it for you, but we really just kept it as in, regardless of where those engagement team members come from, component auditors that are within your network, component auditors that are outside of your network, people within your firm, people in a service delivery center, those resources all in totality. The firm has some responsibility for those. They vary depending on which category they fall in, but we just wanted to ensure that we were capturing everybody that forms part of that engagement team and performs procedures on engagements.
And I think that's an important point because I also think it's a point that we brought up in our March meeting. If you think about a large international audit, there may be auditors from different offices, from within the network, external to the network. There could be auditors from other audit firms. So it could be fairly extensive. And in a sense, then this is to some degree pulling them all in under this QM system.
Yeah. It's pulling them all in, recognizing the fact that there will be variations as to how the firm has policies and procedures depending on where those people come from, right? It's, there are some things that are just easier to get, hurdles to get over when they're within your firm versus a firm outside of your network. We also recognize the fact that, evaluation of competence and capabilities of people's engagement team members often happens at the engagement level. And so there's a combination of things that happen at the, at the engagement level, and there's a combination of things that happen at the firm level. In totality, those have to come together to ensure that we have sufficient and appropriate resources for the engagements the firm accepts. And so that's the fundamental principle we're trying to convey in the standards.
Okay, good. And there, I do have a couple of hands up, but there's a few people on the CAG I haven't heard from yet this morning. And so I'd like to get, I think it's important that we get the full diversity of views, and maybe the views are all supportive of where this goes. But if you haven't commented yet, I ask that you raise your hand and provide some feedback. It doesn't have to be on this particular section. It could be on any of the previous sections, but I think it would really be helpful to the task force to hear from just about everyone on the CAG on this matter. So I'm going to recognize the hands that are up, but I think this will be a chance for you, if you haven't raised your hand, to think or formulate your thoughts or questions. So with that, Paul Munter.
Great, thank you, Jim. I think that last discussion you're just having is an important point, and maybe this is jumping ahead a bit to the discussion of ISA 220 and maybe ISA 600, but as those projects are moving along, particularly the way that the ISA 600 ED describes the engagement team, making sure that there are processes in place both from a QM perspective and from an engagement specific perspective for managing the resources, not only within firm, but across a group audit circumstance, which I would imagine in most cases would be within network, but it could be also outside of network. I think it's going to be very important that the standards are aligned in the way they are speaking about the engagement team and the resources associated with the engagement team itself.
Thank you, Paul. And I have a hand up from Naomi.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. I also wanted to jump on this component auditor inclusion because we are currently discussing indeed ISA 600 exposure draft, and we have concerns about this inclusion into the engagement team. I think I mentioned that already in March. We are actually, I don't know if it's linked to our region, but for the moment, group engagement teams usually use component auditors a lot in some countries and in others as well, and there may be some impact on the audit market actually, because if we lock too much how we use component auditors, when you think about the firm's responsibility related to the competence and capabilities of the engagement team members, so I agree that there should be something, but if it's too high level or too demanding, the network may actually always prefer working within the network. So I can understand from a public interest perspective that this is very stringent, so then stakeholders may think that this is locked and everything is fine within this network firm, but actually that we need a vibrant audit market as well with other perspectives. We have also the statutory audit requirements that are linked to that. So you have the statutory audit made within the country that are sometimes used within the group audit. And so how all of that is going to interplay. So I was wondering maybe if the task force has done any impact assessment, maybe in Europe, or discussed that with national standard setters, because we are a bit afraid of the impact on the audit market, generally speaking, which can be quite heavy for our profession.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. Hyson, I see you have your hand up.
Really, I speak on behalf of EFAA, but also I would like to speak on the perspective of the audit in my country. I heard that there will be also some kind of, how to say, some kind of reaction when it comes to group audit, and there are local audit firms that are cooperating with other firms in other countries in order to perform this kind of audit. And in this issue, there are some things that need to be stressed in that matter that will be very, how to say, understandable and useful, especially for the local auditors or SMPs in such a case. Do you hear me?
Thank you, Hyson. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, background noise, I think. Yes, that's better. Okay.
Okay, now you hear me now?
Yes.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because really I do not know what is happening, but sometimes the line is not working very well. So our idea is to have some more address of the scalability to include even the needs of those small audit firms in various countries, because if it is not addressing that issue, then the audit market is going to be much more concentrated to the big firms, and this, of course, is not good for the small audit firms.
Okay, so if I heard you correctly, it might be a challenge for the smaller firms.
Yeah, really, it's a challenge.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Daniel Sarmiento.
Hello, everybody. My comment is the same way, you know. So I think small firms often have a weakness in the human resources. I wonder if it would not be useful to include some special education on this topic for those firms in the same sense Heisen has said. That's the same comment, I think.
Okay, so that's two comments with respect to perhaps challenges for smaller firms or SMEs, and I perhaps we can get some comments from Dawn on that. So Dawn, I'm going to tee it up for you to speak, but I do have a number of other comments here. Paul, good to see you, at least virtually, or hear you. Do you have a comment?
Yes, I do, and I apologize. I'm actually on vacation in Hilton Head, where the internet is not that strong, so I've muted my video, but can still at least provide some oral context. Kind of covers both of the last two topics. First, I wanted to commend the task force on the the external reporting part of it, in making sure that it remains very principle based. I think we always want to guard against being too prescriptive, and I kind of felt that section was very principle based, and again encourage that. Secondly, with regards to the human resources, I wonder, and maybe I missed it in the reading, but I wonder whether this also isn't something that should be communicated to those charged with governance. Obviously, they're firm decisions, but it seems to me there should be some transparency around at least some of the key decisions that are made in terms of expertise needed on an audit, that those charged with governance should be appropriately briefed on. Thank you.
Great. Julie, I do have some other hands that I'm going to call on, but a number of people have made comments. In particular, there seems to be a discussion relative to small firms and the implications for the smaller firms. I want to see if you had any thoughts or comments in terms of some of the discussion at the board level or at the task force level on this.
Yeah, so maybe just a couple things, Jim. There's been a few comments with respect to group audits. I might send that one over to Len. I know he's going to speak on group audits a little bit later. We have been coordinating with the ISO 600 task force extensively, and so there should never be a misalignment between ISQM 1 and anything that's in 600 or 220 or ISQM 2 or other standards for that matter. And so there is an alignment there on how group audits work within the context of ISQM 1. I think a lot of the requirements with respect to competence and capabilities of engagement team members exists today at the engagement team level and will continue to exist at the engagement team level going forward, because that is the place at which the execution of, if you're in the audit context, that's the way the execution of the ISOs happen, and a firm has to have a methodology that exists at the engagement team level for engagement team members to execute on that methodology, which is in compliance with the standards. And so I guess from a small firm perspective, I would think they would have a methodology they're following, however complicated or simple it is, but that competence and capability discussion and determination would happen the same way it's happening today at the engagement team level. What the firm would need to do is just ensure they have that methodology in order to address a risk that, that doesn't happen at the engagement team level. So that's how it moves its way up to the firm level from the engagement team level. So hopefully that addresses some of the comments that have come up already.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Julie. And I want to be sure we had time to get to 220. So I have two other hands I'll recognize here. Megan?
Thanks, Jim. And actually, I think Julie said a lot of what I was going to say. I think that it's important that when you look at what the engagement team is, the focus needs to be on the people doing the work. So they can come from a lot of different sources. And I think also the structure of teams will continue to evolve as firms use things like delivery centers. And, so I think the sort of the historical bright lines between this is the firm and this is the component auditor, I think are becoming, the world is more complex today. So I think it's important to have a foundational principle when you look at what the definition of engagement team is. And for me, that should be the people doing the work. And then I think that the evaluation of the capabilities and the competence of the people within that broader team, I think you can't allow that to not rest with the engagement partner. So I don't think you want a situation where the engagement partner can, somehow abrogate or get rid of or avoid a responsibility because they're saying the firm is taking care of making sure that the people that I have are capable and competent, because in the end, it's really those people and it's the people-to-people interaction which forms the basis for those evaluations about capability and competence. So so I worry a little bit about the firm being, sort of primarily responsible. I think the balance in ISQM 1 is now right. I think the firm does have a responsibility to be responsive to engagement teams when they put up their hands and say, well, we need someone, or the people we have are not capable or not competent enough to deal with this particular aspect. Then the firm has a responsibility to come in. But I think they all kind of need to work together, which I think really was your point. So I know a lot of work has gone into this, and I think it's landing up in a good place because all three pieces need to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, and I see that Shigo of PIOB, you have your hand up, so I'll let you have final comments so we can move on.
Yeah, thank you. I should have said this at a time when we were discussing external communication, but I just wanted to thank the task force for their efforts. As you know, we have placed a big importance on this external communication issues and the transparency report. But I appreciate the way the task force has addressed these issues, and I just wanted to add that for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Shigo. Okay, Julia, I think we're clear now.
All good. Thank you very much for all the valuable feedback that we got. And I wish I could have been to a CAG meeting in person. I've done two, and they've both been virtual for me. So maybe someday.
Actually, Julie, you were just a trendsetter. You saw this pandemic ahead of time, and you already decided to learn the virtual way of doing meetings. So, all right.
Thank you.
ISA 220 is our next topic, and I will hand it over to Lynn. Is Lynn presenting, or is someone presenting on Lynn's behalf?
Lynn's presenting. She's just trying to get off mute.
Okay, good.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you just fine, and certainly you're on the other side of the world from where I am. What time is it there?
It's 12:30, so I can say good evening and good morning to people because they're both right.
Welcome, Lynn. I look forward to your comments on 220. I'll turn it to you. And just for time, I'm sorry, for timing, we have about 20, it looks like about 20 minutes for presentation and discussion, and that would lead to our break at about 8:50 Eastern time.
Okay, James, I'll be as quick as I can be. Thank you very much. 220, since you'll remember in March, for those of you who were here, we presented the full draft of 220, both to the board and to CAG, and your feedback is in the paper. and how we have dealt with it. In June, we dealt with a discussion on the resources section, and that reflected the work that we had done with ISQM 1, and the time since June till now has been largely working between the three standards to make sure that we are consistent between them. So if parts of this presentation seem familiar to you, they should be, because Julie's just said some of them, because this is the mirror in 220 of those same issues. And we are working towards next week or the week after, hopefully having this standard approved. Next slide, please. Okay, consistent with ISQM 1, the same issue in terms of the objective and emphasising the public interest has been raised with us. And we have considered it very carefully and have decided to do exactly what ISQM 1 have done, and that is move a paragraph 6 from the introduction to immediately follow the objective. Because we also believe that public interest is obviously important, we have added some words to requirement 14, which is the expected behaviours of your engagement team, to emphasise that they're the responsibility of the members of the engagement team to act in the public interest. So that's the first change, the significant change we've made. Next slide, please. The second major changes are also in the human resource area, and which Julie has talked about. Our particular perspective on that was in the March version, we referred to engagement resources as being assigned or made available by the firm. And the issue was raised that in component auditors or in a group audit situation, it may well be that the auditor is appointed by the management of that particular subsidiary or that particular part of the group, and that we were technically not correct by saying by the firm in every case. And so we have considered that very carefully, and particularly in the context of the changes that ISQM 1 have made in terms of human resources. And we have therefore made changes that make it clear that the firm may appoint people from within their firm or their network, or they may have members of the team made available to them. However, they still need to, as Julie said, make sure that they have the correct competence and capability to do the engagement. We've also clarified that the policies and procedures for the firm should include this as a case. Should include these situations, I should have said. Moving on to the next slide. The other significant coordination we have been doing is with IAASB, and this is in terms of two sections of the standard. One in terms of the engagement definition, and the second in terms of professional skepticism and bias. And if I can just take each one of those in turn, IAASB is going to use the engagement team definition from Proposed ISA 220 in its work on their definitions. And their project will therefore align with 220 while ensuring that the independence requirements are clear and appropriate and apply only to those individuals within the scope of the revised definition who must be independent in the context of a particular audit engagement. And in terms of professional skepticism and bias, their roles and mindset changes are faithfully transferred into 220 now. So we have the same lists in both documents. So those are the major changes that are made. When you see when you look at the marked up version of 220, the rest of the changes will be around the alignment between the various standards. So we can, that very quickly, that's what we've done to the standard. And last slide are questions. Particularly interested in not only what you think of the changes we've made, but also any other matters. So thank you very much, Jim. Back to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and appreciate that presentation. I'm seeing a theme here, at least on the QM standards, relative to component auditors, which is a very significant in a sense of if you think of a wide range audit that could span across the globe and involve many different component auditors, it seems like all the task forces have dealt with challenges there. So let me see if I have any comments on 220 and your question that you have, whether that be question 1 or 2, if there's anything else that you should consider before finalizing the proposal. So I'm going to go to the room. It looks like Takashi, you're up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lynn, for the presentation, for the current work of the ISA 220. Sorry, I have one comment on the objective. Sorry, again, the same comment as ISQM 1. And also I have one question on the ISA 220. The objective, it seems to be, it's a little long and not clear for me. Maybe the same comment, sorry again, but I understand the public interest also, quality engagement, such kind of concept, including the standard, it is important. I think I understand. But now proposal paragraph 10 and 11, the objective of the ISA 220 is too long and not clear for the linkage of the original objective paragraph 10 and 11. And also the paragraph 11 states the public interest is served by the consistent performance of the quality audit engagement through achieving the objective of the standard. So this paragraph stated in the objective section. So it seemed to me like a tautology. So I prefer the previous version, the paragraph 11 stated in the introduction section. Sorry, this is my comment. And I have one question for the matter related to the objectives. So IAASB or task force, do you have any thought, for example, such kind of the paragraph reference to the public interest or quality engagement into the other ISA, not only quality standards, but also the other ISA. For example, the IAASB is anticipated to revise the ISA to 40 or 500 in the future. So do you have any thought to the including these kind of concepts into the other ISA? I think if so, it seems to me more little strange to me. The balance is not good. So this is one question. Thank you.
Thank you, Takashimi. Anyone else have their hands or perspectives either on the relationship of public interest in QM or on the component auditor side? Megan?
Sorry, pushed the wrong button. Thanks, Jim. So I think I won't repeat the comments on the objective that I made on ISQM 1, but I think that the same would apply here. I think I'm comfortable with where this is settled. And then with respect to the engagement resources section, I don't have any concerns with the way the requirements have landed. And I think consistent with maybe a comment that I just made, I think it is important for this stuff to be principle-based and capable of being adapted to all the different circumstances that we have today, but also that will continue to evolve in the future. So, I do think it's important to make sure we've got the focus in the right place, which is having the right people to do the right work at the right time. That kind of a concept, which I know is what's guided the team to this point. So, so I think that I appreciate the work of the task force in this respect, and I think the way that it's drafted now, kind of works well, and I think it has the principles for how you think about all the resources that need to be brought to bear to complete an engagement, recognizing that some of those resources might come from outside of the auditor's firm or outside of the auditor's network. And you kind of need the right principles in place to govern that. And then the mechanics of how it gets done is obviously going to differ by circumstance. So I'm comfortable with where this has landed. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And we have a hand up, Rob DiTrulio.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so not much to add, but I guess what I've kind of observed is that the three standards, 1, 2, and 220, it looks like there's been some nice coordination now. And in terms of public interest, like the movement up where it follows the objective, kind of accentuates, whatever word you want to use, the importance of public interest. And to the point that Megan was just making, just the principles-based methodology, I think that's so important in terms of ensuring we have sufficient resources, the right players to achieve the objectives. That's what I really wanted to add.
Great. Thank you, Rob. All right, Megan. Sorry, wrong name. Naomi, you have a comment?
Yes. Hi, James. I just wanted to refer back to my comment that I made around ISQM1, because I think we are turning around the same thing here. So I fully agree that indeed, we should strive for the public interest, for quality and better quality management. But we don't want to raise the bar too high and then have implications on the audit market. And this is where I am a bit struggling with for our, at least for our region, whether this may have some very detrimental impacts on smaller firms and the use of component auditors, actually.
Thank you, Naomi. Lynn, those are all the hands I see.
I I can see another one, Jim.
You're right. One has popped up. Paul Thompson.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I just want to echo the point here that has been made quite robustly by Noemi, Daniel, and Hyson, and it relates to inadvertent impacts on the component auditors, who oftentimes are small and medium-sized practices. EFA does have a concern around this. I wanted to actually raise the point when we covered ISA 600 later on in the meeting, but I've decided to obviously make my views known this juncture because we've started to touch upon it. We do have some concerns that ISA 600 and some of these changes may inadvertently result in component auditors, SMPs, being somewhat prejudiced or disadvantaged. The potential for some work to move from component auditors to the group auditor, that may have implications for choice, competition, and concentration issues in the audit market. So I would encourage, certainly in relation to the ISA 600, as and when it's appropriate, that the IAASB does look very closely at this issue, possibly by way of some form of impact assessment of the proposals on the dynamics of the audit market. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Paul. And from the PIOB, Shigawa.
Okay, thank you very much. We have already expressed our views on this issue, and I take it that the task force has really addressed our issues, and we appreciate their efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Lynn, you got quite a few comments in this particular.
Yeah, and thank you very much for those comments, particularly the ones around being principle-based and the coordination, because we have worked really hard to actually coordinate all of these standards, and will continue to do so as 600 comes through. In terms of the question about whether other standards will include public interest, that's an open question as each standard is considered, but certainly the IAASB, we are trying wherever possible to stress the importance of the public interest in our standards and make that a prominent part of them, because that's what we work to do, is to serve the public interest. So I think we don't want to just spread the words around. We want the concept embedded into the standards. So we'll see what happens with other standards, but certainly embedding that concept in the quality suite has been an important part of our work. In terms of the audit market, one of the issues we started out to resolve were the different delivery models that are appearing in the market now. And what we're trying to do in the standard in a principled way is acknowledge that there are different models, they are changing and they are moving over time. And one of the reasons that we've made the changes that we've just made here is to acknowledge those changed models where companies do and will continue to do, I hope, because the market won't work well if it doesn't, appoint various auditors. That means whoever is the engagement partner must be able to have policies and procedures in their firms that can deal with those different auditors. And we're hoping that the framework that we've set up doesn't inhibit the market, but that it actually provides a framework to think about the different parts of your engagement team. So that's what we've done in 220. Obviously, Len will talk about 600 later in the day, but I think, Jim, those were the questions that I was asked.
Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate the feedback. All right, Lynn, thank you for taking the time to meet with the CAG. Appreciate that, and we wish you well in the upcoming board meeting. I'm now going to turn it over. I believe that goes to Brett James to want to cover any aspects of ISQM 2.
Thanks, Jim, but we have Imran Venker on the line.
Oh, Imran is here. Okay, great. Crisscross.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would not have missed this for anything. Thank you.
Good to see you, Imran.
Good to see you as well. Chair, I believe I have about 10 minutes. So I'll be flexible in the planned remarks we plan to make and, of course, the planned slides. It's really good to be here with you, Chairman James and representatives. Good afternoon from Johannesburg in South Africa. I have been to the CAG on a number of occasions to chat about ISQM2. This is probably going to be the last time, but one of the lessons of this time is that I'm always appreciative of the preparations you have made. So I'll just focus on 2 or 3 slides so that we can perhaps still have some time to hear your comments. Grateful as always to have them. I think the last few months, Chairman, have helped us with an enormous opportunity that the 3 task forces have had to further our cooperation, to align our standards. We've had incredible support from the lead staff and then supported by Brett and Willie. And of course, our chairman, Tom, is really just provided the clearest of directions about how these 3 QM standards are the current highest priority for the board. I think we sit at a point now, days away from a final discussion and vote on these, where we recognize that there's incredible market need for this, but also there's a huge market expectation and impatience around the availability of these standards. This extra time that we've had, it's only been a quarter, but I'd like to imagine that in keeping with the tone of the conversation we've had in the last 2 hours, that it has allowed the 3 standards really to dance together, not just walk and talk to each other, but really dance together when they're eventually voted out, and so that they're very tightly knitted together. And I hope that's your observation in looking at it. We had only planned 2 topics for today. One of those topics was to speak about the scope of engagements. The other of those topics was to describe to you how, with the assistance of our colleagues in the ethics board, we had settled the discussion around objectivity of the engagement quality reviewer. But I think that in many of our conversations with you, we are focused on those same 2 things over and over again. And so for that purpose, we prepared a slide, the very next slide, which I think is a really important reflection point for a group as important as the CAG. With so much of discussion about the public interest issues, really just to do an old-fashioned stand back on the standard. And that old-fashioned stand back is really about, we do standard setting in the public interest. Our stakeholders, such as yourself, have made a contribution to this journey. Where have we arrived? And so where we have arrived on this slide describes for us that our stakeholders said to us that there were too few engagements that were being selected for engagement quality review. We have developed new criteria to determine which engagements are subject to that review. Our stakeholders said to us that the skills and competence of engagement quality reviewers needed to be enhanced and address the question of objectivity more carefully. That is what we've done. We know from all that you and others have said to us that EQRs got involved sometimes too late. We have made a concerted effort to improve the timing of the performance of the engagement quality review. We know from what regulators have said to us that there's probably insufficient attention in some cases being given by EQRs to their work. For that reason, we have improved the depth and focus of the proposed engagement quality review. And finally, to address the perennial issue, which is one indicator of water quality, we've dealt with the robustness of the documentation of the review. Chairman, that was a formidable task. Not only have we addressed that, but in the process, you have supported our decision to have a separate standard on this topic, for the standard to be risk-based, and for the standard to be fitting in neatly, hand in glove, with the overall framework of quality management. This is a great point to end this 2-hour conversation on. But of course, with the benefit of only 5 minutes left, I would like to skip, with your permission, please, Chairman, to the question that we had prepared. The question, of course, captures everything that has come before it. The question is a few slides down the road here. And we're going to ask of you, and perhaps use these 2 minutes to listen to whatever further comments there have been or there are from representatives, recognizing, of course, that your previous comments have been fully addressed within the appendices to the paper that we've prepared for you. Even your own reflections about coordination and our responsiveness to your inputs would be welcome at this point. And even comments about how the standards fit together. I think that will also be useful observations to have, having had the discussion on all 3 standards today. So we're posing this question on slide number 8. Do representatives have any other matters for our consideration, please? Chairman, I hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Thanks for that presentation. I was looking back at my notes and prepping for this meeting, and the CAG has been very supportive of ISQM 2 really from the get-go, and so we seem to have less, I would say, I don't want to say controversy, but less questions and more general support for what all the great work that your task force has done. Let me see if there are any additional comments coming from the CAG members with respect to ISQM 2, and I'll open it up.
Thank you, Chairman.
All right, Christian.
Imran, thank you very much for presenting. Imran, very brief question from my side. Have you considered that there is a potential overlap between the ISQM2 project and the IAASB project on the objective reviewer? Can you give us some insights on whether or not you have, exchanged thoughts with that project group?
Imran, I do have one other comment, so let me try to let's see. It looks like Hussein. Hussein?
Sorry. Yeah, my comment is about duties of quality engagement quality reviewer. In the text, it's mentioned that its task is, its objective is objective of evaluation of significant judgment. Yeah, during the inspection, as a regulator, sometimes we observe that because of how can I say, paying not more attention or focusing on some issues, some mistake, some big mistake result in important non-compliance with standards or regulation. Therefore, I think this significant judgment should there should be more application guidance on these issues. This significant judgment should also cover important. I'm mentioning about audit of financial statement, but this can be applied other services provided by professional. For audit, significant account are important, and also evaluation of risk assessment also important. Therefore, during this review, engagement quality reviewers should also look at important account, important disclosure, important or complex transaction or other issues. Therefore, these duties of engagement quality reviewer should be defined more clearly and get broadened. It also cover the issues I mentioned about. It also include some important issues about client internal control. I mentioned about this issue previously, I think previous year's CAG. I think I want to emphasize, I think this significant judgment broader and a little bit uncertain. The application of this depends on professional accountant, and also some auditors assess some issues as an significant judgment. For other auditor, it maybe not significant judgment. Therefore, it should be, we need to get more application, more guidance for this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Sun. I think we can go ahead. Imran?
As always, Chairman, really good comments. Appreciate the thought that has gone into them. Christian, I can tell you that I have gotten together with my IAASB colleagues as if they're a part of my extended family. We have met so many times on this. Sylvie Soulier and her staff have coordinated extremely closely with us to the point that the papers that are serving before them, their board this month, have round-tripped us probably 3 times in the last couple of weeks. There really is the closest possible coordination, but not just in this quarter. I think the coordination has gone back all of 2 years, and it's reflected, of course, in the conclusions they've come to and the arguments we've put forward. And I recognize that that has been an important priority of the CAG. It is important that we demonstrate to the world that we're not just coordinated between the 3 QM groups, but that we're coordinated across the boards. And our 2 chairmen have insisted on it, and the results are there to be seen. So really pleased to give you a very positive, affirmative response there. Hussein, thank you for your remarks. I recall very explicitly these comments. I believe, like you, and like someone who also works as a regulator, as much care as possible around what these significant judgments are is important, so that we close the possibility of misunderstanding and gaps around it. The approach we've taken in this standard and all of the other QM standards, of course, is to deal with them at a principal level in the QM standards. You and others have said to us in the past that we needed to do more. We've responded to that with what in this area is now 9 paragraphs of application material on the subject of significant judgments and significant matters. They run, as you do know, from paragraphs A35 to A43. We further built them out because we believe that at the audit of a financial statement level, or in another type of engagement, perhaps more granular direction is needed. And of course, therefore, in A36, we've now inserted the reference to ISO 220, where Lynn and her team have built out in incredible detail what those judgments are. And if those are the judgments that the engagement partner is looking at, then that's where the EQR is going to follow as well. And similarly, to cater for the non-audit engagements, we've dealt with that in paragraph 837, where we've cross-referenced ISAE 3000, revised, and what those considerations would be. I think the way we are with the board on this discussion is our board, the last time we met on this, was really comfortable and had no residual issues in relation to the possibility of a gap in understanding of what this is. We'll share that feedback, but I hope you're happy that this level of detail is probably the one area in the standard, other than objectivity, where we built it up in quite a level of quite broadly, and that it meets yours and expectations, and ultimately that it will be versatile and be able to be used in the marketplace. And you and I, as regulators and standard setters, would be able to hold each other and certainly hold practitioners to a decent standard around what those significant judgments are that they should be looking at or have detected. Thank you very much, Hussein and Christian, and thank you so much, Chairman James. Handing over back to you.
Thank you, Imran. And we have one final comment from PIOB, so I'm going to recognize Shago.
Oh, thank you. I have no comment, I have no questions. The only comment is that I appreciate the efforts again by the task force in addressing all the issues that we have raised in the past. And I think our concerns have been addressed. And I just want to add that on the issue of coordination between the two boards, I can testify from the PIOB perspective that the coordination between the two boards has been very, very sort of extensive and useful. And I appreciate the both boards on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Imran, thank you for your time. I'm sorry, you were going to comment?
Yes, I appreciate that recognition. I think that recognition is for all of the chairs and staff to share, particularly this task force, Dan Montgomery and Hank and Talatala, in driving those coordination efforts. Not an easy topic on which to coordinate, extremely sensitive, a lot of words involved, really something that they did an outstanding job in. And of course, this is my last time with you, Chair, as in relation to this project. I'd like to really thank you and the CAG for all of your support on this. You have captured it well. You've been extremely supportive from the very beginning, guiding us particularly on the scoping paragraph, which has been contentious, and your support has certainly helped us along the journey, and wish the CAG immense success in the future with all of the projects still to come. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words, Imran. Thank you for all your work you've done, and hope that it goes well with the board meeting coming up. With that, we are going to take an abbreviated break, and the abbreviated break will end at, let's see, at 9:10. So that's about a 3-minute break, and we will resume with ISO 600 and an update on that. See everyone in a couple minutes. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone back. And for our next topic, it's going to be group audits, and Lynn Dewey is here to present to us. So Lynn, I'd like to welcome you to the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thank you for giving me a 15-minute section for a group audit. When I was preparing for this discussion, I was anticipating the number of questions from ISQM 1 and ISO 220. We had 90-minute sessions, actually 3 of them in the past year. So I'm not going to go 90 minutes. A quick report back. I want to thank all the CAG members for providing us a lot of good comments and input in leading up to the exposure period process. And the exposure went out in April, and we're going through a 150-day exposure period due to COVID-19. Just quickly, that we've done a lot of outreach, but more importantly, I want to focus on, in the last few months, we have been spending a lot of time with ISQM 1, ISQM 2, ISO 220 task forces. You heard from Julie and from Lynn and Enron. There are a lot of coordination issues, particularly, but not limited to the resources issues. I want to assure everyone on the call, a lot of robust discussion, alignment has been noted. And if you look at paragraph 21 of the exposure draft, all the related application material, A40 to A46, pretty much aligned with what Julie and Lynn has, mentioned. But of course, the exposure draft went out in April, so some of the new language as well, task force will consider whether we need to write additional application materials and further align the 4 standards. In the past few months, we've done a number of outreach and webinars across the globe, and those have been overwhelming interest, particularly on the scoping, on the risk-based approach, and also some of the specific questions on materiality, documentation, and access issue. Some of the regulators are continuing to focus on access, but they also note that the task force actually had the public interest in mind by addressing access issues. So some do appreciate we try to differentiate different type of access issues. Access issue for the practitioner, access issue for the regulators, they may not be the same. So it's important to know the difference. But I also want to know a few things. I know some of you are preparing for your comment letters, and it's important to know that in our slides 3, I think the next slides, we had a second webinar last month, and in that webinar we addressed a number of questions. Some of those questions were raised earlier in the ISQM 1 and ISO 220 discussion. For example, the risk-based approach, I think Megan said it pretty well. We're focusing on, the right place, the right people doing the right work at the right time, at the right place. And that risk-based approach is so important to ISO 600, as well as some of the changes in ISO 220. That was one of the key foundational standards that's underpinned ISO 600. Of course, without saying ISQM 1 in terms of resources and firms' policy and procedures. So as you prepare for your common letter process, I would encourage you to listen to a second webinar. My task force, Josephine Jackson, Dan Montgomery, and Jasper, we spent 90 minutes addressing some of the questions you see here on the slides. I think it would be very helpful. Personally, I've received over a dozen feedback from participants on the second webinar. For example, the questions about component auditors, the difference between statutory audit, group audits, the involvement of component auditor, how to apply risk assessment in ISO 600, some of the questions about resources. those questions, we actually address them in the second webinar. And some of the feedback I got from national standard setters, particularly, they actually appreciate the second webinar because they really help them to clarify some of the misunderstandings they may have. I also encourage you to read the explanatory memorandum because there's one key concern or comments we heard is we're doing away with the work of a component auditor, but that's not the case. If you go to the explanatory memorandum, we actually emphasize that sometimes component auditors, are the best people to do the work, depending on your risk assessment procedures performed. And we also noticed some challenges. For example, ISO 315 was only approved last year. It's not effective yet. So some people read ISO 600 as a standalone standards, but it's important to go back and read ISO 315, see how ISO 600 incorporate the concept of risk assessment from 315. Once you read 315 and read 600, that might really help you understand some of the key proposals in ISO 600. I want to keep my remarks short, but I want to make sure that I hear from many of you, but also I want to make sure that we don't interrupt the follow-up presentation on ISO 500, all the evidence. I think it's such an important project. So with that, I'll turn back to you, Jim.
Glenn, thanks for your introductory comments. And we do have some comments relative to 600. Laura Schiffman.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. And thank you, Len, for your presentation. I know you've talked a lot about coordination and very much appreciate that. I know everyone is working together on all these various projects. I just wanted to comment on the fact that specifically ISO 315, 220, and 600 have a lot of components that interact and a lot of topics that interact. And for the sake of consistency, I know you guys are definitely focused on that. I think just from a prepare perspective, because those effective dates are not going to be all the same, it might be helpful just, I don't know if it's a Q&A or something that kind of explains, at least from to management, of what to expect and how's my audit going to change and what does it look like when 315 and 220 are effective, but the new ISO 600 isn't, because there's a lot of overlapping concepts, risk assessment and group audit. So I think it would be helpful, just nothing authoritative, but maybe just something that explains the overlap and maybe what to expect and how things will change over the years. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you, Laura. Ming, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, we hear you.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, and I appreciate the work has been done by the task force. Lots of listed companies are groups whose financial statements are consolidated from multiple locations or business units across the borders. So the understanding of scope of group audits is fundamental to the investors as well as regulators. I encourage task force to continue its work to drive change to improve audit quality of group audits around the world. Just a short comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Meng. Do we have any other comments from the group on group audits? Rob. Oops, you're not coming through, Rob.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can.
Yeah, I guess, in terms of access and communication and the group engagement partner being able to, oversee components with COVID, we're sort of in a whole new world, which I thought COVID would be over in a couple of weeks, to be honest. The whole access issue, I don't know what the answer is. Does ISA 600 need to specifically mention, and just sort of thinking out loud, you know, it's been going on so long, and it's just a different world.
Thank you, Rob, for that comment. And there's another hand up, Paul Thompson.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Len, for the update. Eve has been following this project with increasingly closely because of the component auditor aspects of it. I think you may well have been listening in to the previous session on ISQM 1 and 2 and ISA 220, where I think Noemi, Daniel, Hyson, and myself all chimed in, expressing some concerns around the risk of component auditors, who oftentimes are SMPs, being somewhat prejudiced or disadvantaged inadvertently by the proposals. So I won't reiterate that. I just hope that the IAASB does, and yourself and the team, just be very alert to those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. And Laura Schiffman, your hand is still up. I don't know if you have a follow-up or you just, we're going to put your hand down.
Sorry, I forgot to put it down.
Okay, thank you. Takashi.
Thank you, Jen. I have one quick comment with regard to the effective date. I think to align the effective date of ISO 600 to the with the effective date of the quality management, I think it is very, very important, because the linkage of the ISO 600 with the quality engagement, quality management standard, especially ISO 220, the definition of engagement team. So I think it is desirable to the same effective date as it is very important. So I strongly recommend the task force aim to finalize the ISO 600 aligned with the same effective ISQM or other quality standard. Just one comment.
Thank you, Takashi. And then finally, we have a comment from PIOB. Shigo?
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, and I can support the direction of the exposure draft. And I just want to say that we are very much interested in listening to the CAG representatives' views expressed either today or in the form of comment letters to the exposure draft. We very much look forward to reading your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, Lynn, I'll turn it back to you if you have any responses to some very good comments here.
Yeah, just quickly on the effective date, I think the staff and also with Willie's involvement, we have discussed about the effective date, and be assured that we are sensitive about some of the comments we heard, whether we need a bridging document, whether we need a staff guidance. But it's important to know that the ISQM 1, 2, and ISA 220, they have to be effective together. We do know that 600 started out as part of the QM project, but we are very sensitive about having those standards out first. But in terms of 600, we're doing everything we can to make sure there's a minimum disruption, and make sure that if there needs to be, the task force still need to do some work, is whether Extend 600 will work well with the new ISA 220, and we'll make sure that we address that concern. And on the access issue, because COVID-19, I think we're either fortunate or unfortunate that we finalized our ED at the beginning of the COVID-19. So we actually build some application material in the exposure draft. But whether that's enough, we don't know, because as Robert said, that COVID has lasted more than we expected. So we asked for comments throughout the exposure period to see that are there any other comments or suggestions that we can incorporate into 600 as well. So that hopefully we'll address some of the initial concerns, but again, the practice might be evolved, and maybe some best practice we'll hear that from the common period process. And on the SMP issues, Paul and others, our focus, PIOB's mandate to us to address public comments, and one of the core comments is to address high quality audits, and audit quality, improve audit quality is most important. I did hear about the concentration issue, involvement of a component auditor. On the involvement of component auditor, I encourage you to listen to the second webinar. And the question is actually also posted on the IAASB website. I think some of the understanding about the involvement of component auditor might clarify if you have a chance to go to the webinar, and before you formulate the comment letter. I think a number of national standard setters have come to me and say they actually feel a lot better in terms of where we landed in terms of involvement of component auditors. On the audit concentration issue, as a standard setter, as I said, we're focusing on driving behavior to achieve a high quality audit. But I'm sure we'll have a course with SMT committees. Once the exposure period is over, we're happy to engage in that conversation. So Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for your comments and your time. Good discussion on 600. We're going to move on to our next topic, which is going to be audit evidence. I think it's very important that we have CAG input on audit evidence, so we may run a couple minutes late. We'll see, depending on what the comments are. But Bob Dorr, we're very happy to have you come present to us and talk a little bit about where we are with respect to audit evidence. I know you have a report back. So Bob, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim, and certainly a pleasure to be with yourself as well as the CAG and other observers today to debrief on audit evidence, the project that we've talked about before. As a matter of fact, March, our last in-person meeting, we did an update and presentation on audit evidence. That report back to the CAG essentially laid out the status of the extended information gathering and outreach session that we had provided at that point, and actually was productive because we conducted some extra outreach after that. We realized that we had been a little light on the preparer community, so we arranged with Laura Schiffman, thank you very much, Laura, to speak with her and get some preparer feedback as part of our outreach also. So maybe the best thing that I can do today is direct you, maybe starting a little bit backwards, with the questions that we hope to cover or address at the end of the presentation. And that's really focusing on your agenda paper D2, which is a draft project proposal, as well as agenda paper D3, which is a listing of issues that were identified in our information gathering and outreach exercise that have been kind of recast or reorganized or categorized by three main public interest matters that we believe need to be addressed by this project. So we'll ask you for your feedback on those documents when we conclude our prepared remarks here. Before I go any further, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the IAASB staff for work on this project. A lot of work been done, really good work, and that's Phil and Jasper have been integral. So thanks to IAASB staff as always. Really, when we've we presented the results of our information gathering and outreach to the IAASB in our June 2020 meeting, and had a real robust discussion. I think, you know, certainly coming out of that discussion, there was consensus around the board that the targeted outreach had served its purpose, and we had met our objectives, that all issues had been identified. And as a matter of fact, the results of the outreach indicated that the issues related to audit evidence that had been identified were considered important, with the exception of some of the outreach or questions we had asked about audit evidence as it relates to subsequent events and going concern, were not deemed as important to the people that we talked to during this audit evidence phase. But of course, that doesn't mean that they're not important topics outside of this particular project. And I think tomorrow we'll hear a little bit more around fraud and going concern and some of the work that the IAASB is currently undertaking. So they were just deemed not as important specifically as it relates to audit evidence. And, you know, clearly, I think the results of our outreach indicated that the issues creating the most difficulties really in practice today are around this concept of how to evaluate the sufficiency and appropriateness, or whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. And I'll drill down into some of those issues in a couple of minutes. We also identified, though, after we looked at all of our outreach and information gathering, our audit evidence working group kind of took a step back and asked ourselves, were there any, you know, kind of overarching themes or issues that maybe we needed to explore a little bit more deeply in the context of commonality among some of the issues that had been raised by our stakeholders. And there were a couple of elements that we came to. One was that perhaps the project needed to address a little bit more overtly or explicitly the relationship between the audit evidence standard, that being ISO 500, and other key ISOs, particularly risk assessment with 315 and audit procedures with 330, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then a second area that was identified was using electronic platforms in obtaining external confirmations. Now, I'll quickly point out that if you're a student of the IAASB literature, you'll know that there was some guidance issued a number of years ago about using an electronic platform as a means of obtaining confirmations. But the issue more that came out here in our more recent outreach was really more broad, in that kind of asking yourself, when would a procedure be considered an external confirmation if, for example, you were granted access to a bank's online banking system where you could observe the client information directly? Is that like a confirmation, or is that some other type of procedure in today's technologically enabled world? So we've also identified that. And then really in June, we talked to the board about what actions we should take, and we'll come back again, but really it came down to two options. Revise ISO 500, including whatever necessary conforming and consequential amendments were necessary, or the other alternative, and they're not mutually exclusive, was to develop non-authoritative guidance to address issues in the interim period. The other phase, there were two other arms, if you will, of our information gathering. You'll recall in March, we talked about academic research. We completed that, explored several academic articles and papers that had been written. Generally, those were focused on academics being concerned specifically with technology, not as much audit evidence specific research and papers being written, but certainly where technology touched upon audit evidence was a pretty common topic. And there were mixed views around whether the standards adequately address technology. And some of the academic research pointed to hesitancy by auditors with respect to use of technology, simply because some of the standards didn't or were perceived to not adequately address what constitutes sufficient appropriate audit evidence. We also, the third piece then of our information gathering dealt with monitoring the activities of national standard setters and others. That was principally focused, of course, at the US AICPA project to revise their audit evidence standard that was already well underway. As a matter of fact, that project has now been completed and the AICPA has issued a final SAS or an auditing standard that will be effective for calendar year end 2022 audit engagement. So we closely monitored that, but we also looked out across the spectrum. There's a number of national standard setters that had either written non-authoritatively or had other projects underway, and we looked at that. So the sum of all of our information and outreach was that really there were no significant new issues other than what had been identified by the Audit Evidence Working Group that came out of that extended research. So at that point, then we turned to what I would call synthesizing the issues that had been identified. If you've had a look at the IAASB board agenda material for June, you know that there was an extensive issues paper that was put together. There were 5 or 6 different appendices to that paper. One appendix in particular, Appendix 4, captured all of the issues identified in our information gathering and outreach, and it was a rather lengthy listing. What the Audit Evidence Working Group has now done is try to capture those issues, combine where there was commonality and reorganize them into logical categories. And those really break down into the 3 primary matters of public interest that we believe have surfaced. Those being around the evolving and expanding sources of information and how that information is processed, communicated, and used. Another category of issues relates, of course, to the continued developments in technology. And then lastly, kind of the capstone, I think, category is given the expansion in the nature and number of sources of information combined with evolving, continually developing technology, there certainly is an aspect, a new view or different lens of professional skepticism to be applied to audit evidence or information to be used as audit evidence. So that information has been captured. And as a result of that, just last week, Thursday last week, the IAASB issued a project update on the project, and that information is captured there. We hope that you were able to read that project update, and the link then to the listing of the issues exists in that space. So what were the working group's recommendations to the board in June of 2020? The working group, is based on all the information gathering and research, essentially recommended to the board that a project to revise ISA 500, open up ISA 500 and substantially or appropriately revise the standard was where the best efforts would be spent in recognizing in our outreach. That ISA 500 project would include conforming and consequential amendments to some of the other standards, and also recognize that there may be some, especially as it relates to technology, there may be some shorter term non-authoritative support materials that could be issued, but that would be taken up by another working group, not the Audit Evidence Working Group, which would remain focused on revising ISA 500. The second recommendation that really came from the working group to the board was that there is likely some more fundamental revisions that may be necessary in the future to other fundamental standards, and those have to do with audit procedures, responding to risks of material misstatement in ISO 330, things like I mentioned earlier, electronic confirmations, analytical procedures, audit sampling, but that this working group in our ISO 500 project would not take on those more fundamental standards, and that those would be deferred to future standard setting as the IAASB's agenda and work plan would permit. The board supported the working group's recommendation to revise ISO 500, including the conforming and consequential amendments, and instructed or permitted, gave permission to the working group to proceed on a rather robust, extensive discussion of the results of the information gathering and research, and taking into consideration the project to revise ISO 500, to go ahead and draft a project proposal that will be considered by the board in our December 2020 IAASB meeting. And as I mentioned, also to issue a project update that has been completed. I mentioned earlier, the project proposal is really centered around how this project serves the public interest. And I think it's critically important that at the risk of scope creep and all of the risk there is at going off on tangents, and especially as it relates to technology, that the project proposal stick very closely to the public interest matters. And you can see there the sources of information, the evolution in technology, and professional skepticism really form the outline for that project proposal. Again, you've received in the agenda materials a draft of the project proposal. I have to stress that it is very much draft. We really, because this is the last opportunity we'll formally have with the CAG prior to the board considering that project proposal in December, we felt it important to provide you with the draft now to seek your input. I just share with you that the project proposal is indeed draft. It hasn't been shared outside of the working group at this point. So please understand that as we spend now the interim period up until December, there may be some changes that are deemed necessary based on feedback and things like that, but we do have time, and we do expect to finalize that then in December. So I think as we look at the project proposal specifically, what are some of the issues that we're looking at? We've got them categorized here by the 3 public interest matters again. Explaining the scope of ISO 500 and its relationship with other standards is critical. It's very interesting, I think, to observe that ISO 500 as written today has as its objective designing procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, and that's a worthy objective. But it's also interesting then to note that actually in ISO 330 are where the requirements for actually assessing on an engagement level whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence have been obtained reside in 330. So we'd like to work on bringing to life what the objectives of 315, 330, and 500 are, and how they articulate with each other, and where the auditor would look specifically for the evaluation of sufficient appropriate audit evidence. That also includes then taking a look at some key definitions that are included in ISO 500. You won't be surprised. Probably the one that draws the most attention, and I think will be focused on heavily, is what is meant by sufficiency of the audit evidence. We had great outreach around that question. Terms like persuasiveness and amount and quantities and things like that were batted about back and forth, and we will address those key definitions as part of our project. I think, you know, when you really look at the core issues coming out of this at a very high level, there was a need or a desire expressed by most stakeholders for a standard that would help auditors assess sufficiency and appropriateness in today's world, as business is conducted in today's world, which of course is much more automated and technology driven. So we will look, as part of this project, developing guidance in the way of attributes and factors that the auditor should consider. When you think about the sources of information, certainly we want to look at the work effort that's involved, using different information from different sources. And then, as I mentioned earlier, certainly professional skepticism is critically important as these sources of information expand and the nature of information also expands. I think it's been interesting to have this project going on, taking place during the pandemic. The IAASB has done great work and certainly put out non-authoritative guidance around remote audit and some of the issues that have been encountered. It was somewhat comforting, I think, to see that the fundamental concepts embedded in our standards today are certainly fit for purpose. But we've also recognized that because the nature and sources of information change in today's world, that there's a different, perhaps, look at how the auditor maintains professional skepticism when doing a critical evaluation of the evidence obtained. I've talked about some of the underlying concepts here. The distinction in the work effort, I just, you know, expand a little bit on this. If you're familiar with some of the background that we used in our outreach, our background papers, you'll know that we wanted to explore the issues around using external information sources or sources of external information, particularly when it might result or be viewed as obtaining information that contradicts management's assertion. And then how do you deal with the accuracy and completeness, the reliability, the appropriateness of that evidence when it's contradictory in nature, but perhaps it's from a source where it may be more difficult to actually test the accuracy and completeness of the information. So that's a critically important aspect, I think, of the project proposal, is to really zero in on trying to identify whether there should be a distinction in the work effort between information produced internally by the entity and other information, and whether that remains appropriate. We also have proposed, or will be looking at in the project proposal as part of this project, incorporating some information on biases, both reflecting perhaps on auditor bias when evaluating sufficiency, appropriateness of audit evidence, but also recognizing certainly management bias depending on the source of the information also. Looking at, you know, should the evidence be analyzed or evaluated with the same rigor if it's used as a source of risk assessment versus substantive audit evidence or tests of details? Looking at some of those differences, certainly something we want to pay attention to. There's a couple of areas I think actually our technology working group are currently addressing in a more near-term, non-authoritative support material mode. For example, when using automated tools and techniques can an auditor actually perform a risk assessment procedure and a substantive procedure concurrently using that automated procedure? We'll be issuing shortly a non-authoritative document coming from the technology working group, but we think that's something also that needs to be taken up in a more robust, wholesome standard setting project also. So looking at technology and then of course coming back again to professional skepticism and recognizing, especially in the COVID-19 world, how that has come to the forefront and is really important going forward. So Jim, I think that that brings us to the asking for feedback from the CAG on the project proposal that they've been provided, as well as the listing of issues. Certainly any feedback and suggestions will be helpful for us as we move to finalize the project proposal in December. And then maybe I'll just come back and cover off the timeline after we get this first round. So
yeah, thanks, Bob. I'd like to get some perspectives from the CAG members. And while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions and raise hands, a couple questions that come to mind. One is, I know the USASB has put forth a similar stand, or has looked at audit evidence. And I just wanted to see if there are any lessons learned from that standard that you would want to share. And then the second is related to technology and the need to artificial intelligence isn't necessarily intelligent. It looks at patterns and whatnot, and just having some sort of standback provision for the human brain to consider whether or not the information the auditor is receiving, whether it makes sense. So it seems like if you knew how artificial intelligence worked, you could defraud the auditor easier in a sense, because you knew where it was headed. So that was sort of two different questions, but if you do have time, I'd like to hear that. But we do have a number of people that have raised their hand, and I want to recognize them. Klaus, welcome. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Jim. A couple of comments. First of all, an overall comment on the project in itself, which I think it's very appropriate. Certainly support the overall project direction that this is going. I think it's a key project moving into the future. A couple of comments from a preparer perspective. I know that you have some preliminary outreach thanks to Laura, which I took note of. So a general comment is that so in the paper here they say that might have implications for specific persons or groups, and I think that certainly that whatever the outcome might be of this project, but indirectly this might also affect preparers, of course, or the clients, and the kind of information that we'll provide. So I think that's an important thing to recognize going forward in the project. And I think especially about sources of information and maybe also technology, those two parts might be affected, I would guess. So from that point of view, I just would like to offer any support that I can give to you in the project from Business Europe. If you want to move into an environment, get in touch with the European environment, I'd certainly be happy to engage with you in the project in any way that you feel is fruitful and helpful to you. So I just want to say that I stand ready to engage and offer the support, whatever what might be needed and appropriate for the project.
Thanks, Klaus. Paul Munter.
Thank you, Jim. Bob, thank you very much for the presentation. I likewise think this is a very important project. I think with respect to technology, I think it's very important to kind of step back for a moment in terms of how you would address the question of use of technology. and ask the question, because some of the academic research I think is very interesting, because it seems to point to two different issues. One is that there may be a reluctance on the part of some practitioners to take advantage of technologies because of the lack of knowledge or unfamiliarity or resistance to change and a whole array of things in that area. But the second one is seems to be a question in the mind of some as to whether the existing standards might be inhibiting the use of technology. And I think the approach to a project would be very different if you thought you were trying to address the second question versus if you thought you're trying to address the first question. So I think it's very important that as part of the project plan, you be as clear as possible as to specifically vis-a-vis technology, which question or questions you are trying to address.
Thank you, Paul. Dawn. Dawn?
Oh, sorry. Thanks. I was trying to unmute. Thanks for your presentation, Robert. I have a few remarks on this one. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge the SMP feedback that's in the project proposal. So our thanks to you for that. I think a principle-based standard that acknowledges the evolution of technology is certainly going to be helpful, as long as it's kept not, it doesn't go into the prescriptive realm, because that could adversely affect SMPs that perhaps don't have the same access or level of resources that a larger firm might, although certainly COVID may have driven SMPs more in that direction, which is a positive thing. I note that the final approval of the standard is anticipated for March 2023. So in the interim, perhaps some non-authoritative guidance would be helpful. And the last comment I have is just an observation on A31, which says that original documents are more reliable audit evidence than photocopies or facsimiles. And I'm expecting, again, because of COVID-19, that will probably be updated, because the reality is that we are dealing with technology-driven audit evidence. Thanks.
Thank you, Dawn. Megan Zietzman.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Bob. So yeah, there's a lot in this project proposal, and recognize that it's still a work in progress, and that you're continuing to evolve it. I think I had some of the same kinds of questions as some of the other folks. So I do think it's important that the proposal be pretty clear and crisp as to what the issues are that are being tackled here, because this has the ability to be, to really be very broad, and then I think it will be very difficult to get done. So, and I agree with, I think, the comments around technology and being clear what is being addressed here. Also important to intersect the activities of this group with the technology working group, and kind of how those work together. This is probably an area where maybe some non-authoritative guidance sooner rather than later would be helpful, given the fast pace of change in this area. So when I think about the technology aspects of it, I think that the use of technology to gather evidence, but also digitally based evidence, give rise to really different risks and different considerations. But the fundamental concepts of, do I have enough evidence and do I have the right evidence? Is it sufficiently persuasive? Really shouldn't be different. So I think that's an important part to be focused on. I should also say that based on the work that the PCAOB has done in this area, and I think, as you're probably aware, we do have a research project that has been looking at the use of data and technology now for some years. Some of what we do here is that there is some angst and some concern that the standards and things will be evolved such that it will then become impossible to do an audit without using technology. And there needs to be a recognition that, at least for some firms, they're not all in the same place in terms of being able to have access to the same kinds of tools and techniques. So there is an important need to preserve kind of the ability to use more traditional techniques and traditional forms of evidence, at least for some period of time, into the foreseeable future. Which I think then brings me to the point around, the definition and the concepts. And I appreciate the desire to relook at the concepts that are embedded in the current definition. But again, I think actually the environment that we've been in for the last 6 months is a pretty good environment to see how those existing definitions have stood up. And, I would submit that I think the concepts of enough evidence and the right evidence, I think the concepts of sufficiency and appropriateness are already intersected. So embedded in the concept of sufficiency is enough evidence of the right type. So you might need just a small amount of something that's really persuasive, but if the evidence isn't very good, then no matter how much of it you have is not enough. And I think that's there today, but maybe it doesn't come through as clearly. So that would be a good place to dig into it. Very supportive of looking at how to increase the focus and provide more direction about how to think about evidence that comes from sources external to the company. So that certainly seems to be, something that's not well embedded in the current standards. But I think, as we know, and I think it was Dawn's point, increasingly a lot of information is coming from external sources, and what's the framework. So, again, they also would encourage thinking about a, kind of a risk-based framework that you would look at where it came from, and that would help you decide how much you need to do in order to get comfortable, and in order to be able to use it. So, so I think lots to be done there. I would also recommend being quite clear about, what conforming and consequential amendments mean in the context of, the other 300 series and 500 series standards. There's a lot there, and I think as you pointed out, it's that would be probably a bigger project to look at all of those things, which I would support, because I think trying to fight it all from one go would probably be a bit overwhelming. But it'll be important to be clear about what you are trying to do in this stage. And then the last point I would make is, I think you talked to this, but I think it doesn't really come through in the project proposal as clearly, is under the caption of professional skepticism, the concept of contradictory and corroborative evidence, and kind of how that would balance. And I think a lot of good work has been done by the IAASB in some of the recent projects, 315 and 540, around putting the focus on the auditor looking at all the evidence that's gathered and not dismissing things that are contradictory. But I think actually when you come to the evidence standard, there's an opportunity to also deal with, kind of the mindset of which evidence do you go for? What's the most, what is going to be the best evidence to gather? And it shouldn't be the evidence that's just the easiest to get your hands on. It should be the evidence that actually will end up being the most persuasive. And I think that, I think 500 is the right place to try to address that. And then obviously on the back end, making sure that you put it all together. So yeah, those were just a few of my higher level remarks, but thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to continue with the questions. There's about 3 more up there. So Paul Sobel.
There we go. Thank you. And Bob, thank you for the very good presentation, very supportive of the direction that the task force is going. The others have probably covered my comments pretty effectively. Let me just maybe summarize with, again, a lot of it's technology related. We recognize the pace of change with technology is very rapid. And I think it will be a challenge, but very important to make sure that whatever changes to the standard are made are ones that you believe will withstand the test of time, given the rapid change in those technologies. It's difficult to have a crystal ball and be prescient, but I do think that'll be important. It's possible that non-authoritative guidance can help bridge it from year to year. But I encourage the working group to make sure that they try to maintain that kind of future crystal ball of what could technology look like in the future, and does this standard properly cover it? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Paul number 2, Paul Thompson.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Bob. I don't have any remarks on the substance of this project at this time. It's really more in relation to what we're learning from this project that may have implications for other projects of the board. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the process that you've been following thus far up to the project proposal stage has been somewhat different to previous projects, in that you've canvassed opinion much more widely. I think it will be very interesting to hear in an upcoming meeting, perhaps, what you've learned, and whether in fact this the approach that you've taken thus far on the audit evidence project ought to be emulated on other projects.
Thank you, Paul. Conchita.
Thank you. I would like to express appreciation on the presentation. The project proposal is well presented, and the major issues raised to be addressed are appropriate from my point of view. And let us keep in mind that standards are supposed to be principles-based. And therefore, while we do consider that the changes brought about by technology are very rapid, principles remain to be principles. And I appreciate the challenges of the working group, because they prepared this proposal some time ago. It takes time to route and to review and then to bring it to this stage. So I appreciate all the efforts. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. And 2 more comments. One is Henry Reeves.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Bob, for the presentation. Just to reiterate some comments already made, really, that like the way this very important project is proceeding. One thing I just wanted to highlight was I really welcome the way that this was emphasizing professional skepticism and making it more robust, because you do read concerns in some high-profile cases that this is sometimes lacking. And I guess just thinking from a financial reporting landscape perspective, whilst estimates have always been a part of the financial reporting, the landscape has been changing, I think, fairly significantly in the last few years. And you've got now some major new IFRS standards, for instance, such as impairment, financial instruments, the revenue standard, the leasing standard, and the insurance standard, all in their efforts to provide more relevant and useful information to users. They're requiring use of management estimates and management sort of assessments of forward-looking judgments on a routine, regular basis, and that's really impacts the financial reporting. So I like the comments Megan said about how this is an opportunity perhaps to sort of pull some stuff together from the other standards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. And a perspective from the PIOB, Chicago.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. PIOB, I think, welcomes and supports this proposed project, but I think it's still too early to identify all the sort of public interest issues. It's because it's an ongoing thing, and in that sense, we are very much interested in listening to the CAG representatives' views expressed today. We may come up with additional public interest issues in due course. But one issue I think we have some concerns, as expressed by other sort of members, is the timeline of the project. It's the approval date is March 2023, which means that the project is a bit lengthy one, and I think that may not be in the public interest. And in that sense, we welcome the use of the non-authoritative guidance as mentioned by some of the other speakers. But thank you very much. That's all I want to say at this moment.
Thank you, Sal. All right, Bob, you've had a lot of rich feedback, and I'll let you close it out with any comments, and I know you're going to talk about the way forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jim. And in the interest of time, I absolutely agree. Very, very rich comments. And thank you to everyone. I won't take the time to go back to everyone's individual comments. They've all been captured, of course. And as I mentioned, this is really a great input, actually comes before the project proposal is finalized. So it certainly will help us scoping, particularly Megan, I picked up your comment about the scoping being so critically important. I think that's right. You can see on the screen here, this is our expected timeline. Shigeo, I have, yes, it is lengthy, going out to March 2023 for expected finalization. I am sure that Billy and Tom and the staff we will do everything we can along the line while still respecting due process, of course, to move this along as quickly as possible. Just a couple of very high level responses, and actually, Jim, maybe I can use your couple of questions that you started off with to kind of summarize, I think, a response to many of the comments. Yes, there was an AICPA project. We've looked at that. We've monitored it. One of the things, or a couple of the things that I think has the working group through our outreach has settled on is that the conceptual, the fundamental underpinnings of audit evidence have been with us for decades. And there's actually nothing wrong with those basic fundamental things like sufficiency, appropriateness, accuracy, completeness, things like that. But the real challenge is how to keep that in a principle-based manner while modernizing the standard to reflect the business transaction world that we have today. So how do you keep the standard relevant? How do you modernize it while retaining fundamental concepts that have proven themselves over the years? And I think that is one of the challenges that the working group and eventually a task force will find themselves faced with going forward. I do think, sticking to a handful of principles is where the US went, but then using a great deal of application material and examples to try to illustrate the application of those principles in both a technology-driven world and a more manual world. The fundamental concept should work in both, but they may be viewed a little bit differently. So I think that's a big thing. You also mentioned technology, of course, is a big feature, and there was some reference to artificial intelligence and deep machine learning, things like that. I think, we didn't touch on this briefly, but actually I think some of the work that likely will come forward with respect to some of the bias work will be critical in that mode, things like automation bias. So when you challenge artificial intelligence the same way you would challenge an individual if you made an inquiry and they responded. So it's applying that, I think, consistently across the standards. So I think, Jim, again, very, very rich and thoughtful feedback, all of which we've captured, and now we'll go back to our draft project proposal and make sure that we shore up the areas of that proposal that people have mentioned, to make sure that we're articulating the feedback received from the CAG and then look forward to moving and having that project proposal approved by the board in December. So thank you very much for your your input and feedback, and hand it back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for your time and the presentation. This will conclude our meeting today. I appreciate the discussion. I appreciate the input, and I think that worked very well via Zoom. And so I'm very encouraged with where we ended up. We will reconvene tomorrow. Again, it will be at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, or wherever you are at that time. And look forward to hearing a little bit more about LCEs. We'll have the fraud discussion and then the work plan in the private session. So I wish everyone a great rest of your day or evening, and I will see you bright and early tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Jim.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you all.